Chapter 6 of the International Mechanical Code talks about duct systems. This is an extremely important chapter for anyone going into HVAC because this is a lot of what you're going to either be manufacturing, installing, or servicing. It is very important that after we complete our overview, which is what this lecture is about, you need to go back and reread this section very, very carefully. I'm going to cover the main headings and some of the main points you're going to find in each section. It's up to you to follow through at the end of this. So we're going to start with section 601. As usual, this chapter starts with a general definition. Tells you the scope of this chapter, what is covered, what is not covered, and some important points about everything, some overview that goes across all sections coming after. Duct systems, again, are used for the movement of air in air conditioning, heating, ventilation, and exhaust systems. They all have to conform to the provisions of this chapter, in other words, what's in this chapter, except as otherwise discussed in chapters 5 and 7. If you remember, chapter 5 was exhaust systems. Chapter 7 is going to be talking about combustion air and chimneys. They have some specific requirements for duct systems. Talks about, very important, 601-2 talks about air movement in egress elements. Corridors cannot serve as supply, return, exhaust, or relief or ventilation ducts, because corridors have to be smoke-free at all times because of emergency egress. In other words, getting people out of building in case of fire. Section 602 talks about plenums. It talks about general requirements of plenums. Limited to one fire area, cannot cross firewalls, cannot install any fuel-fired appliances. This is because of smoke movement. Plenums are the main ductworks that come off of and return air to the heating and cooling systems. Talks about the construction of plenums, talks about the materials that can be used in the plenums, talks about wiring, sprinkler piping, pneumatic tubing, and combustible electrical equipment. Talks about foam or plastic insulation. Talks about semiconductor fabrication areas. Again, we have to be very careful with plenums because they can catch on fire, they distribute smoke, things melt, things burn, they have extreme temperatures. Section 603 talks about duct construction and installation. In other words, sizing has to be with the ACA Manual D. Duct classifications, metallic ducts, and you'll notice metallic ducts refer back to SMACNA HVAC duct construction standards. Table 603.4 talks about sheet metal thicknesses. For galvanized, minimum thickness, talks about aluminum gauge requirements. Talks, if you look on the left-hand column, duct size, galvanized gauge numbers, aluminum gauge numbers. You must follow those standards, but those standards are minimum. You'll get the exact standards from the SMACNA, Society of Sheet Metal Manufacturers and Installations. Non-metal duct is discussed. Flexible air connectors are ducts. Talks about duct sealing for underground ducts. Talks about all other joints, seams, and connections. Talks about the material you can use. Talks about duct supports in 603.10. Not exceeding 10 feet apart. Approved hangers, again from the SMACNA areas. Talks about mechanical protection, weather protection. Talks about registers, grills, and diffusers. This is all Section 603. Section 604 talks about the insulation that can be used in ducts. Section 604 is concerned about energy efficiency as well as smoke, fire, and flame retardants. That's the purpose for 604.3. Talks about vapor retardants. Has to do with we don't want mold and mildew building up in ductwork. Section 605 talks about air filters. Section 606 talks about smoke detection systems and control. We want to make sure that we detect any smoke in ductwork and then shut all our systems down. We do not want to be moving smoke around ductwork. Section 607 talks about duct and transfer openings. Talks about ducts with dampers. Talks about how we have to have smoke dampers in certain places. How smoke dampers work, 607.3.2. Section 607.5.4 talks about corridors and smoke barriers. Gives you a whole bunch of examples in terms of where smoke detectors and dampers are required and where they are not required. Section 607.5.5 talks about shaft enclosures, horizontal assemblies, penetrations. And 607.6.2 talks about membrane penetrations for roofs and ceilings. So 607, Section 6, or Chapter 6 of the International Mechanical Code, has one very direct purpose. It is to talk about duct systems and fire control and smoke control. So at this point, what I want you to do is I want you to start looking at the discussion questions in the same lesson. I want you to reread this lesson. Again, go into more detail. Try to figure out what they're talking about. Words like should means it's required. Go back through here. Understand the fire protection aspects, because that is what's going to be on your licensing test.